Hi, I'm Dr. Richard Scott Noakes, and welcome to the mini lecture on the Decameron. The Decameron is an interesting story because it has this frame text that surrounds 100 stories. The 100 stories are told by 10 young people, and what happens is the plague has struck Florence, and these 10 young people meet and they realize that they have no one else left. There are 3 young men and 7 young women. And so they decide that they're going to go out to the countryside to sit out the plague. And as they have nothing else to do while they're out there in the country, they entertain themselves by each one tells a story for 10 days, 10 stories, 10 days. Of course, these stories are all told by Giovanni Boccaccio. And so Boccaccio, some of these stories he is making up himself. Some of the stories he is taking older stories or stories that had previously existed. But each of these, I think, gets at what happens in response to a trauma like the plague. We're going to return to that idea at the end. But first of all, let's look at some of the stories. Of course, in your anthology, you have only a few stories. You don't have all the stories, but I just want to give you a couple things to think about. The first story, which is a very funny one, is about Ser Caporello. Ser Caporello is a figure who is what we might call an anti-saint. Rather than living a saintly life, he lives the most unsaintly life possible. And so in Ser Caporello, we have the story of how he manages to convince people before he dies that he is a saint. And the story is very clever in that it demonstrates for us that the way to do this is not for him to say, "Hello, I'm very saintly, you should revere me," but rather he has a keen sense of human psychology, and instead he says, "I'm not at all saintly, I'm a horrible person," and then the things that he describes he has done are naturally very minor things. In the end of the story, we get to what might be considered the moral of the story. And the storyteller says, "It was thus then that Ser Caporello of Prato lived and died, becoming a saint in the ways you've heard, nor do I wish to deny that perhaps God had blessed and admitted him to his presence, for albeit he had led a wicked, sinful life, it's possible that at the 11th hour he was so sincerely repentant that God had mercy on him and received him into his kingdom. But since this is hidden from us, I speak only with regard from the outward appearance and say the fellow should rather be in hell in the hands of the devil in paradise." And if this is the case, we may recognize how very great is God's loving kindness toward us, in that it takes in account not our error but the purity of our faith, and grants our prayers even when we appoint as our emissary one who is his enemy. When reading this paragraph, there's a little bit more to it. Reading this, I think we need to think about the way that it must have felt to be around during the plague when so many people were dying, and to feel like God was not answering your prayers. And here we have a kind of, the Decameron opens with a response to that. The 9th story on the 4th day is the story of Guillaume de Rousillon and Guillaume de Cabestan, which is essentially the story of a kind of love triangle that ends violently. This is not, of course, a funny story. And so often I think people aren't certain what to do with it. It seems like a romantic tale of love and murder. But instead, I think here, what we need to note is that Guillaume de Rousillon and Guillaume de Cabestan both are named in the same way. They're both Guillaumes. And when you see something like this, one where you have 2 characters that have essentially the same name, what we start to suspect is that they are symbolically the same person. And so as you're reading this 9th story on the 4th day, the story of Guillaume de Rousillon and Guillaume de Cabestan, instead of reading it as them being 2 separate characters, how would you read this as a psychological story in which these are essentially two parts of the same person, 2 elements of the same person, the wife's lover and the wife's husband, and the way in which a single person struggles to maintain both of those roles and what it means for her. On the 8th story on the 5th day is a story of Nostalgio the story of Nostalgio and the ghostly hunt. And this is, of course, a story about a young man who falls in love with a woman. She's not interested in him, and so in a sort of attempt to convince her of his love and get out of town because he's bankrupting himself, he goes just a few miles out of town and sets a tent, sees this ghostly hunt, hears the ghost story, manages to get the young woman, the object of his love, to come and hear the ghost story, and then she, in terror out of that, first offers herself to him sexually, saying she'll do whatever he wants, and then he says, well, I'd rather you maintain your honor, and so I'd like to marry you, and she agrees to marry him. What's interesting about this story in terms of what we're going to be, in terms of the prompt, is note how everything is changed by storytelling. It isn't that she dies, it isn't that he dies, but rather the story of what happens to other people is enough to transform them, to transform her, and to cause her first to fear what will happen to her, and ultimately, of course, to love him. The sixth story in the ninth day is the story of Pinocchio and the way that he wants to bed this farmer's daughter, and there is a variety of amusing misunderstandings, and each person ends up in the wrong bed, and people end up having sex with the wrong person. In this case, I think the central object in this comedy is the cradle. The object that's moved around is the cradle. And when you're thinking about this text, try to think about the ways in which a cradle represents the anxieties that we have about extramarital sex, the anxieties we have about potential pregnancy and things like that, and how that might affect the way that we read this. Also, note the difference between this and the story of Nostalgio. The story of Nostalgio, this is a nobleman dealing with a noble woman, and it ends in marriage. The story of Pinocchio, this is a nobleman dealing with a farmer's daughter, and it doesn't end in marriage, it simply ends in a long-running affair. Finally, there's the 10th story of the 10th day, which is probably the most famous short story of the Middle Ages. We have it from many sources, and it's the story that's often called Patient Griselda. And it's a story about a man who decides to test his wife. And in testing her, she shows herself to be incredibly faithful, and superhumanly faithful, and superhumanly patient. When we read this story, I think, from our perspective, we think, oh my gosh, what a horrifying monster. But the way this story was read in the Middle Ages was as a commentary on Christ's relationship to the church. Not that Christ is cruel in the way that the Marquis is in this story, but rather in the same way that Griselda is so lowly in terms of her social class that she should have no expectation of the Marquis' love. In the same way, the church, the church, because of its own corruption, should have no hope of the love of Christ. And yet Christ still loves us, and even when it appears that we are put upon or set upon by events, and it appears that Christ has abandoned us, in actual fact, Christ has not abandoned us in the same way that we have here, where even though it appears to Griselda that the Marquis has abandoned her, at no point has he truly abandoned her. Now, let's talk about your prompt very quickly. The setting of the Decameron is the Black Plague of 1348 to 1350, and that killed approximately a third of Europe. Florence, the city that Boccaccio's from, we guess had probably about a 70% mortality rate. We need to consider the impact of that 70% mortality rate. Boccaccio and his audience lived through this time. This isn't some historical event for them. This is something that they are the survivors of. So the memories of this horror must still be fresh in the minds of Boccaccio and his audience. So for your prompt, I'd like you to discuss how these tales might be read in that context, and how they might use this storytelling to kind of rebuild their sense of themselves and their society.